Hi, everybody. Um, I'm Lawrence Wright. I want to welcome you. We're starting a little late because apparently there's business to be done in government despite it's being shut down. And so I'm gonna introduce the other speakers until Representative Adam Schiff arrives. But I'll tell you a little bit about my own experience with Jamal Khashoggi. And like so many reporters who've covered the Middle East, you have to talk to Jamal Khashoggi. He was the one guy that everybody went to. I think every reporter who's worked in Saudi Arabia would tell you the same thing. I met Jamal in 2003 when I was researching the looming tower, and I was living in Saudi Arabia. Jamal was a big man, tall man, with a big, round, pale face like a full moon. He was a singular figure in the Saudi press even then. He caught my attention when he published an article in the Arab News. And this is what he wrote. Despite the enormity of what happened, we are still in denial. The most pressing issue now is to ensure that our children can never be influenced by extremist ideas, like those 15 Saudis who were misled into hijacking 4 planes on a fine September day, piloting them and us straight into the jaws of hell. I can't stress enough how courageous and rare that statement was. A month after we met, Jamal was hired as the editor of Al Watan, and I visited him again on April 7th, 2003, as American and coalition troops were occupying Baghdad. Jamal was the only Saudi I met who was in favor of the war. He thought that America could do for the Arabs what they could not do for themselves, which was to bring democracy to the region. He lasted, I think, 3 months at Al Watan the first time. One of the reasons he was fired is that he published a cartoon of a cleric wearing a suicide vest, and instead of dynamite in the pockets, there were fatwas. Imagine doing that in Saudi Arabia at that time. He came back and was hired again at Al Watan, and that lasted for 3 years, and he was fired again. And then he was hired to run an Arab satellite channel, and it lasted all of 11 hours. Progressive views didn't have much of an audience there. Eventually, he was forbidden to write or comment on television or even to tweet. So in September 2017, he fled Saudi Arabia. The circle of freedom was narrowing really quickly. And it was only 2 months later that this wave of arrests began, with hundreds of businessmen and reformers and clerics being arrested. Fortunately, Jamal found a home in Washington and at the Washington Post. And he wrote in one of his very first columns, "I have left my home, my family, and my job. I am raising my voice. I can speak when so many cannot." That voice cannot speak now. We must speak for him. We may not know where his body is, but we know where his spirit is. It is here. It is in the hearts of everyone who cares about human rights and freedom. It is with the families of the 53 journalists who were killed last year and their friends. It is with all of us who care about these things, and we have to thank Jamal for awakening our own spirits to the universal values. So we thank him and other fellow journalists who've lost their lives and honor them for their sacrifice. So I ask if you would take a moment of silence to remember them. Thank you very much. I have the pleasure of introducing my friend Mark Warner, who has been very supportive of this, and I think he represents some of the interests that we've gotten in Congress from both sides of the chamber about press freedom and the danger that journalists are facing today. So, Senator, if you would speak for a moment.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you for your efforts to remember Mr. Khashoggi, also the enormous amount of truth you've brought to your journalism in all its various activities. There's a famous line that says the only security of all of us is a free press. Now, that was written by the only Virginian I know that writes better than Don Beyer. That was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson made those comments over 200 years ago. And in many ways, the gentleman we honor today, Jamal Khashoggi, lived those words and died for those words. And I think the best way that we can recommit ourselves to his memory and to that notion of security being intimately intertwined with the free press is to make sure that we all step up and do our part, regardless of whether we served on a press side of the ledger or whether we serve on the other side as policymakers. And I think that challenge is perhaps greater today than it's ever been in our lifetime, not only because of what we see around the world, but I think it is fair to say in frankly, a bipartisan fashion that there's never been a time before in American history where we've not had an American president who also stands for those values. But today, we don't have those kind of statements coming out of this White House. Today, when we see these kind of tragedies, we don't have a strong statement from an administration reaffirming the rights of a free press, both domestic and on an international basis. So it is up to all of us, whether as journalists or as policymakers, to take to heart those words of Thomas Jefferson of over 200 years ago, to take to heart the example that Jamal Khashoggi lived, both in his tenure as a journalist in Saudi Arabia and in his time here in the United States, where not only did he work with the Washington Post, but he lived in Virginia. So we honor his memory 100 days ago from the disappearance, and we should all commit to the notion that as much as possible, never again. It's now my honor to bring forward someone who is lives this, works this throughout his career, someone I've had the honor of knowing for multiple decades, who in his current duty as publisher of the Washington Post, makes sure that we have that news in a free and open and complete way. My friend Ryan. Fred?
Thank you, Senator Warner, and to Chairman Schiff, Co-Chair Chabot. On behalf of the Washington Post, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this special tribute today. Jamal's death has touched Washington Post colleagues deeply. Yet this story is not just about the murder of one innocent journalist. Jamal's killing is part of an escalating attack against press freedom that's being waged by tyrants around the world. And that's why we can't just let Jamal's story fade away. His assassination, in many ways, I believe, is a red line. It's a threshold where those who believe in human rights and those who believe in free speech must stand firm against those who would callously snuff them out. The brutality of Jamal's murder, reported to be on the orders of the Crown Prince himself, the extensive Saudi efforts to cover it up, and our government's apparent willingness to accept these repeated lies have shocked the collective conscience of freedom-loving people around the world. How we respond to Jamal's killing demonstrates how committed we are to a fundamental American value, support for a free press, both here at home and abroad. Americans rely on independent journalists around the world, especially those who are working in closed societies where facts are hard to come by, to cut through the propaganda and bring us the truth. Our political leaders need full and detailed information in order to make crucial decisions about America's national security. American business leaders need reliable insights in order to make wise financial investments. And American voters need to know which countries are friends and which are foes, so they can evaluate our foreign policy and hold our elected officials accountable. Having such information is fundamental to our freedom, and any policy by any government that silences reporters and restricts access to this information is an attack on our country and everything we stand for. The world is watching carefully to see how America will respond to this challenge. And we should not allow the size of a tyrant's checkbook to blind us as to the importance of standing up for America's values. Congress can demand full and immediate transparency into the circumstances of Jamal's killing. You can, and we hope will, hold the perpetrators of Jamal's murder to account, no matter where the investigation leads. Jamal's killers and those who would seek to emulate them must hear from the United States and the civilized world that if you jail, if you torture, if you murder a journalist, there will be serious consequences. Thank you to the leadership that you are all providing to protect these values that are so fundamental to our freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Those are very stirring words. I really appreciate that. I'm going to invite Representative Steve Chabot now, who is the co-chair of the Committee of Congressional Caucus of the Freedom of Press.
Thank you all for being here, and as we all know, today marks the 100th day of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And I want to thank my fellow co-chair of the House Freedom of the Press Caucus, Adam Schiff, who will be speaking here briefly. And now that his party's in the majority, would have been speaking before me, were you here, but everything's turned around in the House now. But I also want to thank all of you for being here today and taking this moment to remember Jamal's life and his legacy and his impact on journalism. He was an independent voice who tirelessly urged greater openness and reform, no matter what the cost. And as we all know now, it ultimately cost him his life. As co-chair of the bipartisan House Freedom of the Press Caucus, it's my commitment and my responsibility to support journalists who put their own well-being and even their lives at risk to accurately report the facts. Advancing press freedom across the globe promotes and safeguards democracy. Unfortunately, not everyone values this freedom or recognizes its importance. Too often, press freedom is under attack, and people around the world are denied access to fully independent journalism and vigorous public debate. In fact, since 1992, more than 1,300 journalists have been killed across the globe, and over 250 are currently imprisoned around the globe, according to reports. Such numbers should shock the conscience of the world that thirsts for and desperately needs to have full access to the truth. With the death of Jamal and the ongoing persecution of countless journalists around the world, real freedom of the press remains threatened. Today, as we remember Jamal Khashoggi and his legacy, we commemorate his sacrifice for truth, human dignity, and freedom. May he long be remembered. Thank you.
You know, I've reflected as we were listening to this. I don't think that I could have written my book, The Looming Tower, in the climate of persecution that there is towards journalists today. It was a different era. Things have really changed. And to go to a different chamber, I'd like to invite the Senator Amy Klobuchar to come join us now.
Well, thank you so much, Larry. And I'm here as the daughter of a journalist. My dad was a longtime journalist, and he was really there at the heyday of journalism, writing for the Minneapolis paper, covering everything from the 1968 conventions to mafia funerals to the Vikings' 4 losses in the Super Bowl. But we won't go there. And it really makes me see this from a different lens, and that's why I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee, and along with Senator Flake, have given a number of speeches this year on the freedom of press and how important it is for us to stand up for journalists. As we know, the facts here for Jamal Khashoggi are so sad. He walked into that consulate just trying to get the papers so he could marry the person that he loved, and he was heinously murdered. And what did he do that deserved that crime? Well, he spoke out and had the audacity to disagree with the government. That's what he did. And he described himself as an independent journalist using his pen for the good of his country. He simply desired freedom for the people of his country. Last year, he wrote a column for the Washington Post describing seeing some of his friends arrested. And he struggled with what he should do, he said. At first, he said nothing. He didn't want to lose his job or his freedom. He worried about his family. And then he said, I made a different choice now. When asked why he didn't just keep his mouth shut and stay safe, he said, we Saudis deserve better. And so he died standing up for his principles. Since Minnesota wasn't around with the founders of the country, like Mark Warner's Virginia, I will also quote Thomas Jefferson, who once wrote that the first objective of our democracy should be to leave open all avenues to truth, and the most effective way of doing it is through the freedom of the press. That's a journalist's job, to be right and to do right for the people. So we must hold anyone who is accountable for this death responsible, because for me it is more than just his death. It sends a message to the rest of the world, to all authoritarian regimes who are watching what happens here, is that you just don't do this to journalists. As the congressman was pointing out, all those thousands of people in prison just doing their jobs, or worse yet, killed. It's up to us to preserve his legacy. It's a legacy that at its core lifts up our democratic values. His daughters probably said it best, and I quote, "This is no eulogy, for that would confer a state of closure. Rather, this is a promise that his light will never fade, that his legacy will be preserved within us." That's our job right now in Congress, not only for what's going on around the world, but what's going on in our own country. So thank you very much for honoring him in this way. We honor him with our work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lady. I'm especially pleased to be able to introduce Representative Adam Schiff because of the efforts of his office and him personally in putting this together has really made a wonderful difference. So if you would join us, Representative, I'd be grateful.
Lawrence, I thank you, and I have some remarks I'd like to make, but I would prefer to defer to our speaker, Speaker Nancy Pelosi. We're delighted to have you here, and if I could welcome Speaker Pelosi to the podium.
Thank you very much, Chairman Schiff. I was just waiting to hear what you had to say here. And so thank you for being such a force in bringing us together to do what we should do as members of Congress in a bipartisan way, in a bicameral way, not only to remember Jamal Khashoggi, but to act upon the concern that we have. The murder of Khashoggi is an atrocity and an affront to humanity. And the days after his disappearance, members of Congress, both sides of the aisles, both sides of Congress, demanded information and dedicated ourselves to holding the perpetrators accountable. I know that our distinguished chairman of the Intelligence Committee, our ranking member of the Intelligence Committee on the Senate side, and Mr. Chabot, other members, go on and on, Senator Van Hollen. I know that you have all been acknowledged, but I thank you for using your voices in a way. When there were some in our country who were saying that it was really a commercial interest should override our values and how we speak out and act upon those values. We're grateful to leaders, again, on both sides of the aisle, Adam Schiff and Steve Chabot, and also Lawrence Wright and Fred Ryan, Karen Attia, and I'm very pleased that Jennifer Egan is here. It was Jennifer, head of Penn, who was, I've known since she was a little girl, and so proud of her, eager to welcome her to the Capitol. So it's 100 days since Jamal Khashoggi's murder. We mourn and pray. We mourn that loss and pray for his family and commit ourselves to action. We must honor our moral responsibility to safeguard the lives and liberties of journalists, both at home and abroad. And if we decide that commercial interest should override the statements that we make and the actions that we take, then we must admit that we have lost all moral authority to talk about any atrocities anywhere, anytime. We must carry on Khashoggi's mission to defend the free press, our strongest bulwark against injustice, inequity, and oppression. I always say that the free press of all of our freedoms in our country in the First Amendment, the freedom of the press is the guardian of the gate of our democracy. Whatever other violations the government or others may exert, if the press can talk about it, freedom exists. So an assault on Khashoggi was an assault on our democratic principles and our democracy, really. And we in America have to stand up very strongly so the rest of the world sees that regardless of any commercial transactions, whatever they may be, or even strategic location, is not a license to kill. Is not a license to kill. It's quite an emotional time for all of us. Every day is because of the fact that it took place, the nature of the atrocity really outside the circle of civilized human behavior, and the target, not just an individual, but a principle of freedom. Thank all of you for keeping the flame, and we won't forget, and we'll come together as long as it takes until there's justice, and though the message is very clear to the world that in this country, the United States of America, our first amendment to the Constitution, the freedom of the press, is a flame that we will keep burning. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank Lawrence for helping to bring us all together. We're deeply in your debt. I also want to thank Ali Soufan, Alex Gibney, and others who helped inspire and organize this event to mark the 100th day since Jamal Khashoggi's murder. I also want to welcome, and Lawrence may have already, the publisher of the Washington Post, Fred Ryan, who is here with us this evening. I'm very grateful to my colleagues, many of whom you've heard from already. I know others of my colleagues will be joining us. Lloyd Doggett, who I know was very involved in also helping pull this together, and I were just at the briefing by Secretary Mnuchin, and I know he is on his way. Unlike many of you, I never had the opportunity to meet Jamal Khashoggi, but I read and admired his columns in the Washington Post. What happened to Jamal is horrific and barbaric, and we continue to learn more about just how barbaric his murder was. But just as we'll never forget what we have come to learn of Jamal's final moments on this earth, we'll also never forget what he stood for and devoted his last years of his life to, and that is what this event is all about. Jamal's final article for the Washington Post, published after his death, entitled "What the Arab World Needs Most is Free Expression," is a passionate plea for freedom of the press and independent media in the Arab world. In it, he called for a platform for Arab voices that is, in his words, isolated from the influence of nationalist governments spreading hate through propaganda, to provide an alternative to the false narratives he feared were dominating the public consciousness. Jamal contended that only through truly independent media can ordinary people have the information and perspective to improve their lives and demand change. His hopes for the Arab world are applicable anywhere freedom of thought is under attack and where independent journalists fear for their lives. The unfortunate reality is that those conditions exist and are on the rise around the globe. In 2006, I founded the International Freedom of the Press Caucus with a congressman from Indiana, a backbencher named Mike Pence. I'm proud of the work that our caucus has done over the past decade to raise awareness and lend support to journalists who are harassed, arrested, assaulted, or worse for doing their jobs. We carried on the caucus over the years, and Steve Chabot has been an outstanding partner. We've worked closely with many of the organizations that are here tonight, but I'm sorry to say that despite our concerted efforts in Congress among all of the nonprofits, when we look around the world, it is hard not to conclude that the trends are getting worse, not better. Jamal, as you know, was not the only journalist in 2018 who was targeted and killed as a result of his work. Sadly, he is one of at least 53 journalists who paid the ultimate price. Many more have gone to prison and remain there. Some cases many have heard of, like those involving Walone or Jo So-U, Burmese journalists jailed for reporting on the atrocities against the Rohingya. But of course, many other cases, indeed most other cases, are largely unknown. Each death and each imprisonment is a blow against freedom and accountability. I fear this growing trend portends a world in which autocracy and corruption are on the rise and where the ideals of freedom, democracy, and human rights are brought to heel. We will not stand idly by. Not when Jamal Khashoggi is lured to ruthless death, not when journalists in Mexico are shot in the streets, not when an American journalist, Austin Tice, is believed alive and held hostage in Syria for 6 years. Jamal's life was snuffed out in a despicable act of brutality, but his voice carries on with all of us, and it is incumbent on all of us who remain to carry on his work, expose those who spread falsehoods, and support the cause of freedom of the press. Thank you very much. And Lawrence, I'll turn it back to you.
I have a homeboy from Texas, Will Hurd, representing the half of the border with Mexico, and he has been the one person holding back the tide on the wall by himself, and now he's here in Washington, so I'm sure the holes are unplugged. But if Representative Will Hurd will come and speak for a moment.
Why am I here? Because y'all are important. The press is important. Why am I here? Because it's personal. Y'all have helped me throughout my entire life. I spent almost a decade as an undercover officer in the CIA. I was in some pretty tricky spots. Y'all's work has helped get me up to speed. Y'all's work kept me safe. And there's often times I thought I was sneaking into some place and you'd see a journalist there sipping a tea, you know, or having a beer. And so I realize the difficult places that y'all have put yourself in. And now, I've made my opinions on Mr. Khashoggi very clear. Fred was kind to publish those. But I will tell you this has spurred a conversation in South and West Texas. Most people in South and West Texas have a hard time saying his name. A lot of people have come up to me and say, why is this important? It is causing a lot of people to remember why our press is so important. And I think that's why we have to keep Jamal's fight and what has happened at the forefront of so many of our constituents. The United States must unequivocally support international press freedoms. And we have a responsibility as leaders of this country to stand with those who are exercising their basic rights. I'm glad to join this fight with my friends Adam and Steve and the Speaker, and because this can't continue. And to think that in the 21st century, 600 people
600 journalists have been killed for doing their work. We have to stop this, and I'm glad to continue this conversation in my neck of the woods.
Thanks, Will. I now invite Senator Chris Van Hollen.
Well, thank you, Lawrence, and I want to thank Adam Schiff, Steve Chabot, Mark Warner, members of Congress who are part of the caucus, and to all of you here who are fierce protectors of our freedom of the press and First Amendment, and to gather here to remember the brutal murder 100 days ago of Jamal Khashoggi, who sacrificed his life in pursuit of telling the truth. And as Fred Ryan said, we are here to also remember the other 53 journalists who gave their life in pursuit of the truth, including 5 individuals on that list from the state of Maryland who worked in Annapolis, Maryland for the Capital Gazette and were gunned down by an individual who did not like their reporting about him. And we also have to remember, as has been said, not only those who've died, but those who are locked up today for telling the truth and speaking out in their countries. And I think we all have to recognize the fact that the United States has historically, with both Democratic and Republican presidents, stood up for freedom of the press, stood up for the rule of law, stood up for democracy, stood up for human rights. And it's a reality when you have leaders at the highest levels of the American government saying things like the press is the enemy of the people, or talking constantly about the fact that the press is just fake news, that tests the strength of our institutions right here in the United States. But I am pleased to see here in the United States, people in this room, members of Congress and others are there to stand up for the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. And while we are stressed here and challenged, I have faith that here in our country, we will succeed in preserving that freedom of the press. But the reality is that the absence of a strong voice in freedom of the press in the White House puts in danger journalists around the world, copycats, authoritarian leaders around the world who quote the expression fake news and enemy of the people and use that as an excuse to lock up journalists in their country. As Freedom House President Mike Abramowitz has said, bipartisan organization, quote, when U.S. leaders step back from promoting democracy and press freedom, journalists beyond American shores feel the chill. They feel it when they get brutally murdered, and they feel it when they get locked up. So we have to stand strong. We have to stand up for what this country has always stood for, which is a beacon for freedom of the press and the ability to tell the truth and speak truth to power. And the way we have to do that 100 days after the brutal murder of Jamal is to demand justice for Jamal. Because if regimes or dictators or anybody around the world thinks they can literally get away with murder with impunity, it will put every other journalist around the world in even graver danger. So I'm hopeful that this Congress, the Senate and the House, on a bipartisan basis, Democrats and Republicans, will come together and send a very strong message to the regime in Saudi Arabia that we will not stand by and tolerate it. We will demand accountability in every way we can, and that should send a message to authoritarian dictators around the world that we, as the United States Congress, we will continue to uphold our belief in the freedom of the press as an essential protection for democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, not just here, but around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Another one of our sponsors, I would like to invite Jackie Speier to give us a few words. Thank you for coming.
I want to thank Adam and Steve and all those who have come here to speak. I want to also extend my deepest sympathies to the family, the friends, the colleagues of Jamal Khashoggi, who lost a family member, a friend, a colleague at work. The presence of members from both sides of the aisle today, I think, speaks volumes of how important this issue is and how we must really take action in the Congress to speak truth to power. Jamal's sacrifice is one that cannot go unreported through the annals of this Congress. It was such a despicable act, and yet the condemnation of that act by the Congress of the United States or the President of the United States has yet to take place. It is really our responsibility to make sure that Jamal and all of these others who have been killed in 2018 are remembered for having spoken truth to power. As Reporters Without Borders Secretary General Christophe Deloire said, political leaders who fuel loathing for reporters bear heavy responsibility because they undermine the concept of public debate based on facts instead of propaganda. To dispute the legitimacy of journalism today is to play with extremely dangerous political fire. The fire may be metaphorical, but the consequences are just as deadly as a raging inferno. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists' 2018 report, at least 251 journalists are imprisoned worldwide today. Are we speaking up loud enough about that? In Egypt, they have jailed at least 25. In China, 47. In Saudi Arabia, 16. In Turkey, 68, the most in the world. That's why Congress must speak out, and that's why I will join my colleagues in making sure that we do. As Walter Cronkite said, freedom of the press is not just important to democracy, it is democracy. Thank you.
I've got several congressmen from my hometown of Austin since gerrymandering. We're blessed with 5. And so Lloyd Doggett is a longtime friend, and he's been wounded, I can see. But thank you for making the trek over here.
Thank you very much for doing this. Thank you. One of our colleagues, I think, who's not present today, may have, in an apparent attempt to really defend the disgraceful reaction to this Khashoggi murder, have hit a central truth when he said, quote, "Many countries murder journalists." And when those murders or torture or imprisonment are ignored, whether they're directed by a supposed ally or an obvious adversary, whether by a crown prince or the Kremlin or the Burmese military or an Ayatollah or an Egyptian dictator or some tyrant who purports to be a left-winger or any other third-rate thug, each time our government turns its face away and ignores and offers excuses and claims that pragmatism is more important than freedom of expression, the world becomes a little less safe for journalists, and indeed it becomes a little less safe for the rest of us who rely on their insight and who share an unusual preference, those of us who share that preference, to live in a world that is fact-based, even though that seems to be going out of vogue in some quarters. When a House colleague has been lauded for assaulting a journalist on our own soil, the special urgency of this moment literally strikes home. Today, those of us who really only know Jamal Khashoggi through his courageous writing, we join in his name to remember all those journalists who are suffering now, whose only crime is to shed light where there is otherwise only darkness and propaganda. Let's never forget that this one murder, nor the perpetrators who continue at this very moment to continue killing innocents in Yemen. I want to thank you, Larry, and all of the others who encouraged this memorial. I believe that our lasting memorial to Khashoggi and all of those who risked their own personal safety and liberty to report the truth must be for us to never let their suffering go unnoticed and to reject rewards for those who repress them, regardless of whether they're friend or foe. And because we understand that the freedom of the press is not a frill that we can sacrifice, but it is a value that is fundamental to both our security and our personal liberty. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Representative Malinowski next. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. A few months before his murder, I met Jamal for the first and only time at a small gathering in Northern Virginia. He shared with me then his anxiety about the loss of America's moral voice in the world, and in the Arab world in particular. We talked about what that might mean for the courageous democracy activists from Saudi Arabia to Egypt to Bahrain, who could once count on America at least to try to restrain their regimes from persecuting them. In my own mind, I was worried about the safety of some of the brave people I had met in those countries when I was an American diplomat. I was not worried about Jamal. He was here. He was supposed to be safe. And that's why the crime committed against him has galvanized us more than almost any other in recent memory. We know that bad things happen to good people in dictatorships all over the world. Some of their names are here before us. But when dictatorships reach out beyond their borders to kidnap or kill journalists or dissidents who have taken refuge in the free world, that is not normal. As a country that has given refuge to thousands of Jamal Khashoggis over the years, we have an overriding moral and an overriding national security imperative in making sure it never becomes normal. Anything less than full justice, in this case, will guarantee that it does become normal. And that means that the author of the crime, the man who ordered it, must be held accountable. If we decide that he is too powerful or that our relationship with his country is too important to speak the truth, then he owns us. Then Saudi Arabia owns us. And that is not acceptable to me as a member of Congress. With the Global Magnitsky Act, we have given the administration all of the tools that it needs to do what is right, to say to Saudi Arabia that while you may choose your own leaders, you might wish to consider the consequences of giving the keys to your kingdom for the next 50 years to someone who will be forever tainted by this crime. That's a message that I believe America's broader interests in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East also require us to send after the chaos that this man has caused from Yemen to Qatar to Lebanon to his entire neighborhood. And if the administration will not do what is right, Congress can, and I think Congress will. We can and we should wipe the smug the smug smile of impunity off of Mohammed bin Salman's face and restore proper balance to our relationship with Saudi Arabia. If Speaker Pelosi is right and the administration chooses to place commercial interests over human rights and our traditional commitment to our values around the world, this body, the House in particular, should be the conscience of America. It should show the world that the heart and soul of our country has not changed. Thank you very much.
And Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, please. Thank you.
Evening, everyone. In the United States, we're blessed to have many public service professions. School teachers, public interest lawyers, scientists, members of the military, members of law enforcement, elected officials, and journalists. And I can tell you that in my 14 years as an FBI agent, I could probably cite to you probably about 40 cases that were instigated and followed to successful completion based on the successful and very dedicated work of investigative journalists that resulted in justice being served, in victims' rights being restored, and that was all because of the efforts of journalists. And not many people realize that about your profession. And what I think the lesson to be learned here, and hopefully the message that's reverberating throughout the room and throughout Congress, especially as we remember Jamal 100 days later, is that silence is acquiescence. And silence is not okay. It's not okay. Because every time we lost a sister or brother in law enforcement, attack on one was an attack on all. When Gabby Giffords and Steve Scalise were attacked, an attack on one was an attack on all. When a fellow journalist who is defending the First Amendment, defending the Constitution, defending the United States of America, keeping elected officials honest, helping find cures to diseases, engaging in work that results in documentaries that change hearts and souls and lives forever. An attack on one is an attack on all. So although you may not hear it very often, thank you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for your patriotism. Thank you for defending the United States of America that we love. God bless you guys.
Thank you for that very meaningful statement. And another one of Austin's illustrious congressmen, my friend Mike McCall. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Larry. I think you're my constituent. I'm not sure, Lloyd, but we'll both claim him, I think. And I want to thank you for inviting me here today. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the event. As most people know, Larry wrote Looming Tower. I was a federal prosecutor of counterterrorism. Ali Soufan, who the wall was up back then. I would like to say Ali brought the wall down between the intelligence and the criminal side of the house and made a difference in the future of counterterrorism. And the definitive book on terrorism is The Looming Tower. And I'm proud to call you my friend, and all journalists my friend. And a free and open press is so important. And we, the killing of Jamal 100 days ago was shocking. It was gruesome. The briefings we received, unheard of, and we've all read the details. My condolences go out to the family and the friends. And Larry and I talked a lot about the complexities of Saudi. I know we're not supposed to get into Saudi specifically here, but they've been an ally at times. We got to be. Sometimes the hijackers came out, as they did, bin Laden. But there's a geopolitical relationship. We saw some promising signs, I think, in Saudi of moving forward. And we saw, like the decision to allow women to drive, I thought was very significant. But this gruesome killing was a major setback in our foreign policy. And it shows us that changes still need to be made. As the State Department documented in its Human Rights Report, Jamal moved to the United States because he feared that he would be arrested in the United States just because of his writings, his political writings about pro-democracy. and he faced restrictions in his home country. And as he saw that, he saw the United States as really a beacon of freedom and opportunity, and he moved here. We share the responsibility of working together, I think, to spread that freedom throughout the world. And we will continue to stand up for the rights of journalists all around the world to peacefully work to hold governments accountable. So I want to note that there are members from across the aisle on both sides that support this cause. We support the Fourth Estate. We support the press. Without the press, there's no transparency. Without the press, the truth won't come out. We may disagree on a range of issues, but we are united in promoting the right to disagree for others around the world. And the kind of gathering we have here today is not possible in many countries, but it is possible here in the United States. We'll continue to work together to ensure that others around the world have the freedom of expression and protection of the media so that they can write and discuss as we do every day here in the United States. You know, and as the new ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Steve Chabot is on that committee as well, and there are many on the other side of the aisle that have spoken here today, we stand firmly committed to protect the rights of the press and journalists all across the world. So let us use this time, I think, to remember Jamal, who was a dear friend of Larry's. And I know when I got we talked and texted, and I know how it hurt and struck your heart and your soul to the core of this gruesome, barbaric act to which those who are held accountable, who are responsible, need to be held accountable. So let us, again, remember him, as well as all the other journalists all over the world who have been imprisoned and needlessly silenced. Thank you for having me.
I would like to invite Sheila Jackson-Lee, if she would join us here. Representative Lee. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Larry, very much. Jamal is just one more martyr too many. One more voice, one more news story, one more message of freedom, martyred, life lost, and voice silenced. I want to honor him and thank you again for allowing us to come to represent the international face by looking at those in this room of the value of the press and free speech. The First Amendment is uniquely that of our Constitution. The Western world has similar commitments to the freedom of speech. It allows us, even in this place, to have discourse and disagreements, but yet walk away and live to speak for our constituents on another day. Jamal had the world as his constituents. He had the oppressed, suppressed. And his last voice, what the Arab world needs most, is free expression, should be a resounding sound all over the world. This is a stark reminder. Remember those who died to bring the news to the world. What we do without light, and what we do without news and information. Jamal went for a happy moment in that counselor office to be tied with his fiancée for a happy life. He belonged to us and the Washington Post. He stood for the benevolence and the freedom of this nation as we welcomed him as a resident who could be protected and whose voice could be heard. And so I join you in the commitment
and the horrific tragedy that has befallen his family and his lost and silenced voice. But the jubilee and the celebration is that we will never be silenced, and we'll join you in support to ensure that his voice through us will not only be heard, but it will be resounding. It'll be clamoring. It'll be a drumbeat. It'll be unending. To all those throughout the world who've lost their life, may they rest in peace, but may we not live in peace until there is peace, sanctity, and security for the voices of freedom, the journalists around the world. Thank you.
We have 3 remaining speakers from different press organizations, and I'd like to first invite Jennifer Egan from Penn, Nancy Pelosi's favorite writer.
I knew her when she was just a mom of 5. My name is Jennifer Egan, and I am president of PEN America. As an organization of writers and journalists dedicated to celebrating and protecting written expression, we grieve for our murdered colleague and his loved ones. 100 days ago, Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated for writing honest commentary that pinpointed abuses and cruelty of an autocratic system in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a country he loved and had great hopes for. He was killed for being a professional journalist, a writer who was widely read. As a novelist and journalist myself who works with fellow writers worldwide, Jamal Khashoggi's murder felt like an assault on our family. We at PEN America are grateful to members of Congress for holding Saudi Arabia responsible for Mr. Khashoggi's killing and refusing to do business with the man who engineered it. By hewing to principle, you help to ensure that the lurid and horrific facts of Mr. Khashoggi's slaughter, facts that would strain credulity even in a work of fiction, and I say that as a fiction writer, cannot erase his life and work. Jamal Khashoggi explained in one of his post columns, "I can speak when so many cannot." I want you to know that Saudi Arabia has not always been as it is now. We Saudis deserve better. We can best honor Jamal's life, his work, and his ultimate sacrifice by insisting upon our right to speak the truth and by protecting those who speak it in America and abroad. If we do this in his memory, Jamal Khashoggi's voice will endure despite the Saudi government's depraved attempt to silence him. Thank you.
Margot Ewan from the Reporters Without Borders. There she is. Hi, Margot.
Thank you to all the members of Congress who have taken the time to be here today to speak and to co-host this wonderful event, and all those who have helped to make it so impactful. I'm so impressed that there are people standing in this room because there are not enough seats for everyone who's come here to honor Jamal today. I'm the North America Director for Reporters Without Borders, an international nonprofit organization defending journalists and freedom of the press worldwide. I want to thank you all for taking the time today to protect journalists. With these buttons that we have handed out, that many of you are wearing, make me so proud to see you wearing, they're not just for this event this afternoon. We sincerely hope that you will continue to wear them tomorrow and the day after, and so on, since journalists, bloggers, and media workers are under threat every day. By wearing this button, you are recognizing the risks that they take in pursuit of the truth, the self-censorship so many have been forced to practice, and the sacrifices too many, like Jamal, have already made. By wearing this button, you can help us shed light on the wrongs we must right in order for truth to prevail. Together, let's make sure that the sacrifices of those like Jamal who have paid the ultimate price have not been in vain. Thank you so much.
And from the Committee to Protect Journalists, Sharif Mansour. Sharif?
Again, thank you all for coming here today. You can consider me one of the Khashoggis. I'm an Egyptian human rights activist. Members of Congress here and on the Senate have adopted a case for me when Egypt tried to extradite me, even ask Interpol to send me back to Egypt because of my human rights work. And I'm thankful personally for a lot of the people in Congress, in State Department, in the White House, who have helped make sure that I'm safe and able to talk to you today. But I'm also want to use this to send a signal, not just about those who were killed, journalists who paid the price, but also by the Saudi authorities, and not just those who were imprisoned inside Saudi, which, and to our count, are 16, but those who were killed by airstrike by the US government-backed and the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. Another memory today is more than 1,000 days since Abdel Miqdad al-Mujali, a Voice of America freelancer, was killed in an airstrike on an assignment. He's one of 7 journalists who was killed in the same way. As we honor the 100-day memory for Khashoggi, we want to make sure that those 7 journalists, those killings are not supported morally, logistically, or materially by the US government. Thank you very much.
We've been joined by Representative Elliot Engel, who's the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and be our last speaker if you have a moment.
Well, I could say last but not least, but I have to tell you my experience being in this office a long time is when you're the last person, you make it quick. I want to thank all my colleagues. I want to thank the journalists who are with us, and I want to thank people from all over the world who are protecting journalism and freedom of the press each and every single day. I know there are people here that knew Jamal Khashoggi, who worked with him, and I want to convey my deepest sympathies. There needs to be accountability for his murder. It's not something that we can just let go and forget about it. His loved ones deserve justice, and frankly, we lawmakers have an obligation to push for that justice. We also have an obligation to be champions of a free press, open press, in all countries around the globe. America's role in the world cannot just be about advancing our strategic and material interests. It's essential that our values lie at the core of our foreign policy, that they underpin everything we do overseas: democracy, human rights, the rule of law, the things that make governments more transparent and responsive, that make societies more inclusive and prosperous, that build stronger friends and partners for our own country. And there's nothing that shines a light on corruption and impunity better than a free press. There is nothing that reveals the plight of oppressed and marginalized populations better than a free press. A free press possesses the greatest tool to drive progress and change and help advance those values, and that tool is the truth. That's why journalism can be such dangerous work. When journalists seek and tell the truth, they become the targets of those who reject these values. In far too many places around the world, journalists are harassed, detained, jailed, and killed for doing their jobs. So protecting journalists, advancing a free and open press all over the world needs to be a priority. It is for me, and I want you to know it will be for the House Foreign Affairs Committee going forward. As the motto goes for the newspaper that published Mr. Khashoggi's columns, the Washington Post, and I quote, "Democracy dies in darkness," unquote. So I want to thank you all for providing the light against that darkness, and I'm proud to partner with you in that important work. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all the speakers who have spoken so stirringly and courageously today. In closing, I just thought I would say something about, let's just remember the man that we're honoring today. He is a Muslim. He is an Arab. He is a Saudi. And yet the most precious thing to him was freedom, freedom of the press in particular, but freedom. He was fighting for freedom. And what this tells us is this is a universal value. It's not something just American, but he loved America because it embodied freedom. And I think it's incumbent on us to cherish our country as much as he did and to show that we will support him in his fight to bring freedom to his own people. So thank you all for coming.